Mouthwashing is a short game with a lot to say, but you really have to listen. So in this video, I'm going to take a close look into each and every character, piece together their backstories, their actions throughout the story, and any subtext or symbolism in them. Almost every character is somewhere between likable and tragic, except for Jimmy. So yeah, there will be full spoilers for the game from here on out, so you should go play the game. It only takes a few hours. It's really pretty, I like the sunset screen. Oh, and before we start, I'm Levin, a game developer who publishes development logs on my main channel, But.Why.Levin, and video essays over shows and games and stuff on this channel. So let's start with the character analysis. The first character I'm going to be looking at is Swansea. Swansea is an old grump who is unfair and mean to Daisuke. Annoyed by the very existence of Jimmy, looks down upon Anya's skills and dislikes Curly's authority over him. And those were all lies. Or at least partial ones. Swansea is someone who has been through a lot, and though he made it through it all, he has become a bitter old man. He despises the pony expresses neglect and ridiculous expectations for him. They have saddled him with an apprentice who knows practically nothing about maintenance, and one who there isn't even room on the ship for. Swansea is a complicated character. In the brief time we get with him in the game, we get lots of mixed signals from him, and I think this largely has to do with her point of view character being Jimmy. And Swansea really doesn't like Jimmy, especially later on in the story after Anya confides in Swansea about what Jimmy did to her. But I think one thing is clear about Swansea. He is somebody who has trouble connecting with people. Swansea was once an alcoholic, and he lived this life for 13 whole years. But one day, he happened to have a vision of him winding up dead, and this scared him into getting sober and pursuing everything that supposedly makes a good man. He marries, has kids, gets a house, a real job, a dog, seniority, and he promises himself that he'll never go back to the bottle. But he's not just one slip up away from falling back into his addiction. But then throughout the story, we get to see how he really fails to connect with Daisuke, his apprentice who he pretends to despise. But he cared deeply for the kid, and he tried his best to protect him, as he was likely saving the cryopod in order to give Daisuke a way out of the crash. But he fails to communicate with him. I'm sure that Daisuke understood to some extent how Swansea really did care for him, but in the end, Swansea wasn't able to protect Daisuke from Jimmy, and it's because he went back to the drink. As soon as the crew realized that they're hauling ridiculous amounts of mouthwash, Swansea gives up and decides to spend his last few days drinking. Well, it wasn't just a slip-up that got him into the situation, as his life is pretty much doomed. He did ultimately choose to die as a drunk rather than live out the rest of his days as a good man. It's hard to blame him for this, but thanks to his inebriation, he doesn't realize what Jimmy is planning and accidentally allows Jimmy to knock him out and get Daisuke killed. Though once again, I really don't blame him for returning to his addiction when faced with almost certain death. It's unfortunate that abandoning his role as a straight-laced guy, even if it was always just an act, results in the death of his apprentice. Swansea, ever pragmatic, recognizes that Daisuke has no hope of living after getting injured in the vents, especially now that Jimmy has used all the painkillers on Curly, so he brandishes the axe that Curly entrusted to him and ends Daisuke's life himself. He regrets not opening up to Daisuke earlier and laments on not only the premature end to Daisuke's life, but also the loss of an opportunity to have a much closer relationship with somebody had he had just been willing to show some weakness around him. What happens next is very unclear, as it's possible that Swansea decides to kill Jimmy, and Jimmy might even have to escape through the vent as he chases him with the axe. But somehow Jimmy ties up Swansea in utility. It's possible that Jimmy just imagined Swansea's attack and wanted to take out the man who is still a danger to him, to completely take control over the ship. But in his final moments, Swansea confides in Jimmy that he was never really satisfied with his life as a good man. The lifestyle of a working man with a family never really fit Swansea. In the best days of his life were the 13 years he spent in the haze. Swansea sees himself as a man who was never really meant for a real life. He only ever found happiness and escapism through alcohol. But he is confident in his failings and identity. In the end, he knows himself, and he berates Jimmy for his refusal to acknowledge Jimmy's own failings, his pitiful attempts to run from the justice he deserves. Swansea's final regret is simply that he couldn't save Daisuke, and Jimmy shoots him. I think it's notable that although we see Jimmy aim at his head, whenever it fades back in, it's clear that Jimmy shot Swansea in the chest, likely resulting in a slower death. Jimmy's cowardice and unwillingness to at least make Swansea's death quick only brought further suffering to Swansea. As usual, Jimmy only brings suffering to those around him, but we'll get to that person later. This also stands in stark comparison to how Swansea put Daisuke out of his misery. This is somebody who he actually deeply cared for, unlike Jimmy's relationship with Swansea. But despite all this, Swansea was willing to brutally kill Daisuke with an axe. He was willing to go for the head. He was willing to do something horrifying in order to put Daisuke out of his misery quickly. He might see himself as a worthless man who can only face his own mortality when inebriated, but he was also willing to make any sacrifice necessary for Daisuke and the crew. He truly cared. Next up is Daisuke, who is a character who instantly endeared himself to me upon starting the game. He's just a likable guy. Now, he really sucks at doing most things, but that's also part of the charm. So I really hated how at first it seemed like most people treated him like garbage, especially Jimmy. Daisuke's slacker personality is the whole reason he's on the ship to begin with, as his parents didn't think that he would ever amount to anything. So they signed him up as an intern for the Pony Express, hoping that he would be able to make something out of himself. We see throughout the story that Daisuke approaches everything, even being stranded in the middle of space, with a lot of optimism. He imagines being rescued and being lauded as famous survivors. He does everything he can to help around the ship, even if that just means reorganizing the remains of the kitchen 4 times, as he's not that great at doing most things. And there really isn't all that much for him to do. But whenever he tries to be helpful and take initiative, he usually ends up making mistakes and troubles for others. Mostly for Swansea. I think that this is a really human and compelling issue that he has. He's perceived by many around him, his parents, and most of the crew as a slacker who doesn't really care much. But he is clearly trying to push himself and prove himself to others. He desperately seeks validation and praise from others. It kinda seems like he's got the gifted kid syndrome, but seemingly isn't all that gifted in any places. Of course, that's just looking at places that he's expected to be good at, like in school in his backstory or doing maintenance on a busted up spaceship. Daisuke is shown to be passionate about many other things throughout the story, from some of his doodles like Yimpy to baseball, which he mentioned several times, to his love for thrifting, which is mentioned in the Q&A with the developers on Steam. But in the world they live in, Daisuke was forced into a lonely and brutal job on a long-haul ship made by a company that clearly doesn't care about its employees, rather than being allowed to pursue any of his passions. This touches on what I think is the central theme of the whole story: control, and how different characters control others and are affected whenever they lose control over their situations. For Swansea, his life had him oscillating between escapism from reality to an obsession with controlling himself to become a good man. And this ultimately ended with him losing that control over himself, and thereby losing his ability to control the situation and save Daisuke from Jimmy's influence. Daisuke, on the other hand, almost is never shown to have any control over really any aspect of his life. He's forced into an internship, seemingly incompetent and unable to help in any of the ways he wants to, manipulated by Jimmy into doing something that he knows is dangerous. Daisuke has almost no control over his life. This is tragic, and Daisuke clearly suffers from this. But he is also always trying to look at the positive side, trying to joke his way out or tough it out. Daisuke clearly is just a good kid who is trying to do what's right. He's seeking praise from anybody who could possibly give him to it, and whenever Swansea is unwilling to, he gravitates to Jimmy, who does treat him with some dignity, even if it's just so Jimmy can manipulate him to suit his own needs. But in the end, there's absolutely nothing that can be done. All the painkillers were used on Curly, and the alcohol was used to knock Swansea out. Jimmy has used up nearly every resource that could have saved Daisuke and then put him on death's door. And everybody is completely helpless in the situation to help Daisuke in any way. Well, except for one way. Daisuke deserved better. Curly is a good guy, mostly, but there's one huge mistake that he makes, and that flaw makes it really hard for me to be sympathetic to him. But I'll try, cause this guy suffered. Curly was rendered completely unrecognizable from the crash. He can't move around or do much of anything now. And throughout the game, Jimmy feeds Curly copious some acid painkillers, because, you know, Jimmy is such a swell guy. However, before the accident, we get to see Captain Curly at work. He's a competent and capable captain, able to steer the ship and prevent conflict with the crew with the help of his trusty code scanner. Curly has an immense amount of, say it with me now, control over the ship as the captain. Everything has to go through him, and Swansea openly hates this, while Jimmy more covertly hates this. There are pragmatic reasons why things like guns and axes should be kept from crew members who are cooped up in space and tend to go a little crazy. And things like restricting the amount of sweetener and cakes they have are insanely stingy, but also have obvious cost-cutting benefits. Curly himself is still under the thumb of the company, and he is facing the same oppressive conditions on the ship before the crash as the rest of them. But he at least has some control over a situation and authority over others. But despite this, Curly is looking for more. He doesn't want to be a captain forever. Yet he understandably doesn't want to continue doing this job forever. But he's afraid of failing. He's also afraid of never changing. He's at a crossroads, a normal thing that many people face. And Jimmy hates him for it. I'll talk about it more later, but Jimmy seems to take any success that Curly has as a direct insult to himself. And Curly even considering trying to do something different and leaving behind this life makes Jimmy feel inferior to Curly and feel like Curly is abandoning him and the crew. But I'll talk more about the J word later. So whenever Curly tells the rest of his crew about the bankruptcy of Pony Express Company, he likely is going to be in a much better position than the rest of them are after this trip, being that he's the super successful captain guy with lots of experience, and the rest are all considered to be pretty much replaceable, basic employees. Even Swansea, with all his experience and skills, is getting pretty old and probably will have trouble finding a new job. But despite how Jimmy tries to paint it, Curly only seems to want the best for his crew, even if he wants to leave behind the life of a space trucker. And though his crew is mad at him after this, it seems that they quickly begin to miss their captain as soon as Jimmy takes over, despite how hard Jimmy tries to convince them of Curly's terrible actions and that he crashed the ship on purpose. Of course, there is one terrible action, or inaction, that defines Curly as a character. And so I'm going to address what is probably the most important detail of the story that is really only implied through subtext. But I, and the overwhelming majority of the community, think it is very clearly the intended reading. However, just know that I will probably be censoring a lot of words relating to it. Trust me, I don't want to, but YouTube will hit me with age restrictions, which absolutely kills a video. It happened to my very first video essay I ever made on my old channel, and I really don't want it to happen again. But that's just to say, Jimmy has and Anya. This is a dark and serious topic, and I'll try to treat it with as much weight as it demands. But yes, I am going with this interpretation. It also is made very clear that Curly knew what his friend did, and instead of actually doing anything to stop Jimmy, he tries to work it out with his friend, come up with some way for Jimmy to avoid consequences. This is completely unforgivable, but it is worth looking into why he did it, and how he justifies Jimmy's action and his own inaction. It's pretty much all summed up metaphorically here with this scene that he shares with Anya. Anya comments on how she appreciates the nighttime screen, but she notices a dead pixel in the corner, and this is always stuck in her mind. Well, Curly states that he can't find it, and remarks that it must be because he's always trying to see the bigger picture, though now he'll always remember there's a dead pixel and maybe try to search for it. Looking at the bigger picture certainly isn't a bad idea, but there's a reason that there's a saying for being too focused on forests. Curly is missing or is purposely overlooking a very big thing whenever he looks at Jimmy. Curly has known Jimmy forever. They've been friends long before Jimmy became his co-pilot and long before Jimmy committed this act. Curly still sees Jimmy as an overly good person, one who he's friends with, and one who might have done a bad thing, but who is still good. He doesn't really see Jimmy as capable of doing it again. He just kind of completely removes Jimmy's assault and treats it as a separate thing that just happened, and not something that Jimmy did of his own free will. Despite seemingly being kind and sympathetic to Anya, it's clear where his loyalty actually lies. And I think that this begins to really weigh on him in the days before the crash. Curly also has one break of reality where he experiences a hallucination. And so I'm going to try to analyze the symbolic meaning of this. It's near the beginning of the game, where Curly walks to the cockpit to meet with Jimmy and to try to take his psych exam. On the way to the cockpit, he seemingly falls out of the ship into an ocean with a beautiful sky. But then the area begins to fill with broken ladders, sirens begin to wail, and he starts to see the warning signs. Then the sun rises and it fades to white, before he enters the room with Jimmy. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really sure about this. I think it mostly represents the weight of his responsibilities, his unsureness with the future, and how he's ignoring his own mental breaks and hiding them. And a part of his responsibilities is the assault that he refuses to acknowledge, and how this guilt is eating at his conscience. I don't know what the latter represent though. After the crash, Curly can't do much for obvious reasons, and the only way he can express himself is through his screaming and with his gaze. The game ultimately ends with him being placed into the cryosleep chamber and being put to sleep for 20 years, possibly to be rescued, but I think it's pretty likely that he never wakes up. So since he can't really express himself, I think that what happens to him after the crash has a lot more to do with Jim's character, so I'll get to it later. But through the crash, Curly has gone from the one with the most control over the ship to the one with the least. And it was all because he refused to use his control in order to deal with Jimmy. So one mantra that Anya and later Jimmy repeats is that someone's worst moments don't define them. And I think that this is another core theme of the game. All the characters in the game make at least one major mistake outside of Anya, and that has huge consequences for themselves and others. Swansea fails to communicate and connect with Daisuke. Daisuke trusts Jimmy and ignores Swansea's warnings. Jimmy has a huge board of things to choose from, but the main one is the assault, and Curly doesn't properly respond to Jimmy's assault, and other issues with him. The game is exploring the question of what makes a person good. If one can a mostly good or normal person do something so horrible, they can never recover from it or be trusted again. And how should we judge others, especially ones close to us who have done terrible things? I think that most people in the community, myself included, absolutely draw the line at Jimmy's assault. Some things are so horrible and likely indicative of a much more serious problem in the person that you absolutely cannot ignore them. As for Swansea's mistake, it's very sad but much more forgivable. It wasn't a mistake made out of malice, but because of a common human inability to connect with others. Daisuke's mistake in particular is just really tragic. It's horrible that his death was caused because he was too trusting and just looking to be helpful and praised. But the one thing that seems more divisive is Curly's choice. Is Curly partially to blame for everything that's happened in the story? I mean, he did practically nothing whenever told of Jimmy's assault on Anya. He ignored other issues with his friend and his obvious threatening to literally crash the spaceship and kill them all. which would lead to Jimmy ultimately dooming them? Well, I really don't have a definitive answer for that, and neither does the fanbase. Curly really does seem like a mostly great guy in the flashbacks who did care about other people deeply. But whenever you know about that one dead pixel, it'll always be in the back of your head, gnawing at you. And now it's time to cover Anya. Everyone here is a victim of Jimmy's actions, even Jimmy himself, but Anya especially is. From the very first time we're introduced to her, Jimmy belittles Anya as incompetent. He doesn't take the mental examination seriously of her, and after the crash, he berates her for her uncomfortability with treating Curly because of how painful it is for Curly to swallow the painkillers. Now, I would say there is some legitimacy to his complaints, as Anya couldn't make it into medical school, but also I think this is very clearly dispelled by the fact that Curly is still somehow alive. I mean, look at him. She managed to stabilize him, wrap his wounds, and has been seemingly dealing with every other bit of life support outside the painkillers for him for 3 months with barely any supplies. Anya very clearly has skills in nursing. It mostly seems that she has a aversion to seeing Curly in pain, and how she doesn't want to inflict any more of that pain, even if it's necessary to prevent more pain. And I think this is absolutely trauma stemming from her being assaulted by Jimmy, and how she doesn't want to have control over another person and inflict pain upon them like Jimmy did to her. Jimmy is once again blaming someone else for a problem that he directly caused. Beyond this, Anya is generally characterized as a very kind person who gets along very well with most members of the crew, especially Daisuke, as the two played board games together. She's just very nervous, especially around Jimmy. There are several hints towards what happened to her throughout the game, with her questioning why there are no locks on the bedroom doors, her being nauseous, possibly showing early signs of pregnancy, and also the fact that the ship was made for 4 people, but there were 5 on board. Someone is probably sharing a bedroom with somebody else. I don't know if this was important, as Anya did ask about the locks, but it is worth mentioning. A few days before the crash, we see Curly confront Anya about the fact that she has stolen the gun. Curly is afraid that she plans to hurt herself with the gun because of the fact that she'll be out of a job after this, and he reassures her that he would do anything for her, as the crew is his responsibility. But clearly he ends up prioritizing the well-being of a closer friend over hers, even if Jimmy deserved everything that was coming towards him, and she deserves safety and justice. But Anya decides to hide the gun so that Jimmy can't get to it. She does this knowing that Jimmy can't currently get to it without the code scanner, so she must fear that Jimmy would be willing to steal it, or that Curly would be willing to assist Jimmy in him getting the gun and possibly killing her. Either that, or she believes that Curly is just so ignorant to Jimmy that he would be willing to give the scanner to him, not expecting him to steal the gun. Despite Curly's words, Anya just did not trust Curly to protect her, so she steals the gun box in order to give herself a bit more control over the situation. At the very least, she's now the only one who has control over the gun, even if she can't use it. During this dialogue is when we get definitive proof that Anya is pregnant with Jimmy's child, and also is where it's made abundantly clear that Anya did not consent to this at all. And so the crash happens. Anya keeps Curly alive, but after being berated by Jimmy for her inability to give Curly his painkillers, she locks herself in the med bay. It's unclear entirely why she chose this time to do it, but it's likely a combination of the crew running out of food, with this being a problem for Anya especially, as she refuses to drink the mouthwash to survive, as well as Jimmy's unraveling mental state. And so ultimately, Anya wants to regain a bit of control over her life, even if it's just in the end. She talks to Jimmy and Daisuke through the door, and she restates that she believes that someone's worst moment does not define them, but also that this is not her worst moment. It's her best. She truly believes that dying on her own terms and keeping Jimmy from getting to Curly and the gun is the best option for her. And I do have to kind of agree with Anya. Considering that she likely wanted to save the sweet pod for Daisuke, her choice to sacrifice herself and prevent Jimmy from getting the gun and continuing to torture Curly is probably the best choice she could have made. It's a horrible choice, but also a selfless and brave one. But yeah, Anya's story is incredibly sad. She really deserved better, but in the end, she was able to take some control over her life back, even if Jimmy was able to sacrifice somebody else's life in order to get control over the gun and Curly. And now it's time to discuss the J word. He sucks. I don't have to tell you why he sucks, but perhaps it's worth looking at what made him this way, not as any sort of excuse, but as an explanation. Jimmy was brought onto the crew by Curly, who promised him that it would be a good opportunity. Jimmy was really struggling before, as he was someone who never really could do well on Earth, but he apparently takes well to being in the crew, especially as he's Curly's co-pilot. He says, quote, "I like it, we're in control here," end quote. Jimmy is a person who constantly desires control, even more than others. It's likely why he has Anya. And then whenever this meant that he might lose control of his future career, he crashed the ship in a last-ditch effort to escape punishment. And then he instantly grabbed control and took over as the new captain. And when Anya locked herself in the room and everything was seemingly going to shit for him, he killed Swansea and decided that he needed to be a hero, trying to control what people would think of him if they showed up. He would rescue Curly, he would control their perception of him, and he would control his own perception of himself, dying thinking himself a hero rather than the monster he actually was. Before the crash, whenever he's confronted by Curly, he tries to blame Curly for his assault. He tries to make others suffer from the consequences of his own actions. Jimmy threatens to kill all of them just to keep his and Curly's names clear. He promises to take care of it, and Curly does nothing to stop him. So Jimmy dooms them all. Throughout the story, Jimmy seems to think of himself as a hero. He acts like he's saving Curly from his name being ruined. Then he takes control of the ship and starts trying to find a way for them to survive. Parts of it are act, like how he blames Curly for crashing the ship. But as he slips further into delusion, he starts to think of himself more as an actual hero, and he starts to lash out more at the others for their inabilities to solve the problems that he's creating. And then, after Anya locks the door, Jimmy starts to desperately seek to fix the situation. But everything he tries just makes things worse and worse. He really believes that he is great in his role as the captain and that he has made selfless sacrifice after sacrifice to help others, but he is really just trying to fix problems that he caused. Just like the mouthwash that's too sugary to effectively do his job, Jimmy's attempt to be a hero only makes everything worse and worse. And in the end, whenever Jimmy and Curly are the only people left, Jimmy finally acknowledges the guilt that's been gnawing at him. He needs to take responsibility. He needs to fix things. He needs to save Curly. For whatever reason, he decides that the responsibility that he needs to take on is Curly's life, not owning up to his terrible acts or anything like that. He just needs to save the captain. So he decides to get in a few extra atrocities before his death, cutting off Curly's leg, eating a bit of it, and then force-feeding some of it to Curly. Once again, he acts like he's helping him, but in reality, he's just hurting Curly more. Then he goes over to the sleep capsule, puts Curly in, and himself. Jimmy dies believing himself a hero, a selfless person who saved Curly's life, when in reality, all he did was cause every single problem aboard the ship and then make it all worse trying to solve it. All because of his assault on Anya and his unwillingness to accept punishment for his actions. Jimmy is a disgusting person, and he dies believing himself a hero. So that's an analysis of all the characters, but I do have a bit more to say. First off, I'm going to actually review the game, and I'm going to finally talk about a big part of the game that I haven't really touched on yet. The gameplay. So gameplay wise, the game is kinda weak. It's mostly a walking simulator, despite having some decently fun mini-games like cooking. I don't really hold this against the game too much though, as it was obviously not designed with gameplay as the main objective. It's a video game, so you can interact with the world and give you the unique experience of seeing things from a perspective of Curly or Jimmy, not for some really unique gameplay or anything. But it also has horror sections, and I have mixed but mostly positive feelings on them. Sections like the graveyard where you have to Swansea, and the big heart with a horse fetus inside are really fantastic. The invisible horse section is really cool as well, although it goes on for so long that I started getting annoyed and bored at the end. Overall, I really like the metaphorical elements of these horror sections as well, as it adds a lot more to analyze for the game. And finally, my review for the story. Well, I clearly like it. After all, I made this video over it. I don't think this game is ridiculously incredible, but I do think it does what it sets out to do remarkably well, and my only real complaint is that I do think it's a bit too short. Another 30 minutes or so of mostly dialogue and character building, while it would have probably been too much to ask out of the small team, would have really improved the game in my opinion. I feel like all the characters have fantastic introductions and finales, but there isn't enough room to really breathe with them. Like I barely knew Daisuke before his death. I do think spending a bit more time marooned in space would really help sell the idea that they're stuck up here. Specifically, I think an expansion between the time whenever they discover the mouthwash and whenever Anya locks herself in the medbay would be ideal. But that's really my only critique, and I understand why they didn't make it any longer. Game development is tough. One final thing that I'd like to compliment the game on is its usage of old footage of cartoons and television. While the looks and aesthetic of the game overall are fantastic, I think this in particular is a genius way to fit in with the retro, worn-down look of the whole game, while also fitting in with a low-quality imitation of the American dream so much of the ship's rooms are modeled after. And because all the TV clips are old and often retro cartoons, it only makes you feel all the more disconnected with the real world outside the ship. And this imitation out in the cold void of space, with fake windows, fake food, and annoying talking horses, it really gives a weird combination of nostalgia and isolation that I really adore. So let's end this video by talking about what is basically the main source of everything that all the characters go through throughout the game. The Pony Express. All of the characters struggle with the lack of control they have over their lives. Well, that's because the company is in control of it all, with insanely overbearing rules, isolating and dehumanizing work, and not to mention the fact that the ship is literally falling apart. I think one of the most interesting parts of the Pony Express's evils, beyond its more surface-level anti-capitalist themes, is how the ship is designed in such a way that the captain has all the power. The company assumes that, in every case, the captain is in the right, and should have control over all the other crewmates. The captain is literally given access to several methods of killing everybody else on the ship, with the assumption that they will not use this power unless the crewmates deserve it. By abusing his relationship with the captain, Jimmy manages to crash the ship, take over as captain, and is only temporarily stopped from getting the gun by Anya breaking the rules and hiding it from him. The company operates on the assumption that those in power are always correct in their actions. They have power, and so they must deserve it. There are almost no mechanisms given to the other crewmates to protect themselves from the captain, with them not even being allowed the luxury of locking their own rooms. Beyond that, there's also the mascot himself, Polly. He appears in several of Jimmy's illusions, and he usually represents his guilt. And I'm not gonna lie, whenever I first started this game, and I got to the sequence where the Polly appears several times in the hall, I worried that this is gonna be a crappy mascot horror game. Luckily, I was quickly proven wrong. But outside of these horror sequences, Polly is always a contrasting figure. His posters are cartoony and are supposed to give basic advice to the crew members, but are followed by fine text detailing collective punishment, 5-hour total sleep and leisure restrictions, and endless pay docs for every little thing. His voice lines are clearly patched together from other segments, and overall, he just feels insanely cheap. He's a slipping mask that the soulless corporation puts on that isn't really fooling anybody, but it'd be weird if they were just honest about their intentions, so they keep it up. It's also notable how many painkillers are on the ship whenever there's little other medical equipment for actually treating injuries on board. Just like how the ship is filled with foam, which stops them from dying but actively prevents the crew from doing many things that could help them to escape. And the mouthwash, which only allows them to get drunk and numb the mental pain, as well as the sleep capsules that only just push off the problem into the future. The company provides no real solutions for disasters, just band-aids that temporarily lessen and extend the suffering, but don't treat the root cause. So, is the company the true evil? I mean, the Pony Express and society as a whole seems to be why Jimmy can never get any control he wanted over his own life. The whole world was designed to hold him and the rest of the crew down. Who can blame him for... Okay, yeah, I feel sick even writing it in jest. Yes, Jimmy is absolutely to blame for his actions. All the other crew members and all of us live under oppressive systems. We don't all assault people, case closed. So whenever I first played this game, I did come out of it feeling a bit disappointed and underwhelmed. I liked a lot of the parts of it, especially the art, and I sort of liked the characters, but I didn't feel as endeared to them as I'd hoped I would. However, as it began to look up things I didn't understand or things I missed, like a lot of the mentions of the subtextual assault, I began to appreciate the game a bit more. And whenever I finally decided to try making a quick video over it, it quickly began to balloon into a full video essay. Going back through footage of the game, piecing together all the details and dialogue, I still wanted more, but I also came to appreciate every bit of what we got out of this game. Not a second is wasted, almost every scene is memorable, and I think that I actually really love the game at this point. So yeah, I'm really glad I played the game, and really glad I made this video over it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you did, then maybe consider subscribing and checking out one of my other videos. I recently did one over Nine Souls, which is another fantastic game that came out this year that has a great narrative and some horror elements that you might be interested in. And I also have videos over Amori, which is my favorite horror video game of all time. But either way, thanks for watching all the way to the end. Bye.